This is the first time that they had different music for the Pixar and Disney logos, so they could properly set the mood for the start of the film. This segment is set with a golden hue to give the impression that everything was supposedly at its best at this time in their lives. Syndrome and Buddy's voice are played by the same actor, and they achieved the Buddy voice by having the actor Jason Lee speak in a higher pitch while also raising the pitch of his voice in post-production. Many animators and people in the production crew were cast as ensemble characters. For example, the producer John Walker voiced the Reverend. The colors in the opening present-day scene are muted to match Bob's depressed feelings. Pictures of Pixar employees' teeth were used to get references for the characters in the film. At the time, The Incredibles was the longest movie Pixar had ever made, with an almost 2-hour runtime. When films are long, it means that they are also expensive, and this scene was almost not included in the film to cut costs, but they decided to keep it in because without it, the story would have been too heavily focused on Bob's problems. This was the first Pixar film that needed lots of people to populate its world. Designing unique models for each would have been too time-consuming and expensive, so instead they made a generic model of each gender and made slight variations to that. For supporting characters with more significant roles, they added a little more detail. So you might be surprised to know that the principal and Bernie are both made from the same generic model. One of the hardest aspects of the dinner table scene was keeping track of the continuity of all the food, especially the broccoli. Each of the characters' powers mirrors their social character. A young hyperactive boy with super speed, a body-conscious young teenager has force fields to create protective bubbles and make herself go invisible. A mom with 3 kids has to stretch in a lot of different directions, and a baby who is full of possibility with no discernible power yet. The car conversation scene is atypical for animation because you don't often see 2 animated people just sitting in a car and talking to each other. Writer and director Brad Bird was originally against the animator's idea of having the frozen bullet in space because he thought it would require the audience to suspend too much belief. 4 different animators worked on this scene. One animator did Bob eating the cake, another when Helen busted Bob, one for the argument, and another for after the argument. This scene was one of the first they did in storyboarding to convince Pixar execs the film should be made. They were skeptical at first because they were worried the film would be too focused on Bob and Helen's marital problems. In the initial stages of the scene's development, Helen didn't use her stretch power to stand up to Bob, and test audiences felt uneasy about the argument because of Bob's hulking size over his wife, which made the argument play out like spouse abuse. Rather than rewriting the scene, they fixed the problem by having Helen's body stretch to deliver the final line to help her measure up to her husband. Bob's cubicle is the only one with a towering heap of papers to emphasize how confined he is at work. If you look closely at the cactus in the background of this scene, you'll notice that it's in the shape of Bob's boss, Huff. Mr. Incredible's character model is built with a partial skeleton and muscles to show musculature under the skin. This was the first sequence made for the film. One animator worked on this long shot, which took many months to make because of the complex character animations involved. The back pop gag was one of Brad Bird's favorites and was included in the original pitch to Pixar. This shot is one of the most difficult shots in the film. It took months for the team's best animators to create. Another difficult moment was this shot. Brad Bird imagined Edna as a mixture between a fashionista and a tech geek sidekick from old adventure and spy films. Her ethnicity was also a mix between Japanese and German descent. Brad voiced her character because they couldn't find anybody that could do her voice as well as him.
This is not the latest fashion, this is the earliest fashion. It will be the latest fashion a year from now.
Mr. Incredible and Syndrome are caricatures of Brad Bird. They wanted to get some crabs from Finding Nemo to be in this shot, but for reasons unexplained, they couldn't get them. The animator in charge of the guard getting hit loved the assignment so much that he made many different versions to pick for approval. The Goo Ball Sequence was made just like traditional filmmaking, by creating one long take and placing multiple cameras in the set to capture the scene at different angles so they could do the quick cut effect in post-production. Brad Bird wanted a price to be paid in this scene, so he originally had Helen's friend Snug flying the plane so he could be killed off to give the story some high stakes. Although John Lasseter thought that it would be better if Helen was the pilot, because it would be a cool part of her character if she could fly, and eventually Brad admitted he was right. Some of the most difficult effects to create are water, fire, and hair. That's why this moment right here shows that Pixar is the best there is, because first, you have the explosion with all the debris in the air, hair blowing in the wind. Helen becomes a parachute. There's water. Her parachute body goes into the water. Wet hair reacts to the water, a fuselage crashes and sinks, and characters have to look like they're floating in the ocean.
Nobody does it better.
The sound of the velocipods is made up of knives being sharpened. In the early stages of the story, Brad was going to have everyone in the family fly except Bob, to use as a running gag throughout the film. These two old-timers were voiced by two of Disney's 9 old men, Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston. Frank died just before the film was released at age 92. Brad Bird's son Nick was the voice of the young boy, and also Squirt in Finding Nemo. And his oldest son Michael did the voice for Tony. There's a long-standing Pixar tradition that John Ratzenberger voices a character in the films, and in this one he voices the Underminer. Brad Bird almost didn't include him in the film, but once he realized that every Pixar film had been successful up to that point, he thought he should continue the tradition for good luck. If there's another movie you'd like to learn about, please leave a comment below, and if you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe to learn more fun facts about your favorite films.